Psych students. We are down to about 123 days until we have the exam, and we're like a third of the way through with the content. So I'm excited to get into the learning unit. This is where I see the most understanding of psychology to come out. You know, I say I like every chapter. Well, I didn't really like sensation and perception. It's difficult, but I love learning. I love the learning unit almost as much as I love the bio unit. So I want to jump right into it because there's a lot of really good applicable things that we will understand in behaviorist psychology, or what we know as learning. So we'll just start with the basics. When we talk about how you manipulate and change and learn things, we talk about it in the idea of conditioning. This is how events and behaviors become associated with one another. And there's two kinds. There's two kinds of conditioning, and these are critical that you really that you know. The first one is classical conditioning. And classical conditioning is when somebody is usually manipulating or changing factors in order to produce a result. In order for you to do something, somebody is like monkeying with things or like messing around with things in order for you to change your behavior. So that's classical conditioning. We'll look at examples of this, and unfortunately some of you won't be in class, but it'll really make a lot of sense when we are in class. Of course, at any time, if you and I can go over this, if you are learning from home, I am more than happy to kind of talk about those things. The other kind of conditioning is operant conditioning. And think about the word operant like operator. Like you are the operator of your car. So in operant conditioning, it's more the person. I am taking the action to change my thinking, to change my behavior, to change my patterns, to do something that gets me motivated in a different way. So these two types, and the key word here is the association. We need to make this connection. How many times have you heard me say correlation does not mean causation? But where is the association? That's what we are really looking at in classical and operant conditioning. And so the basic definition when we're talking about learning is this consistent change in behavior. I mean, it's that easy. A consistent change in behavior means then you've learned something. If you continue to do the same behaviors over and over and over again, then you haven't actually learned anything. You haven't changed your actions. You haven't changed your behavior. Therefore, you haven't learned it. Maybe you need more conditioning. Maybe somebody else needs to take some action. Maybe you need to take some action. But either way, you haven't learned the lesson, if you will. And a lot of this is based on experience, though. You know, our culture can affect our learning. We, especially in our United States culture and our American culture, we very much equate learning with success. And so if you've learned something, that means that you're going to be successful. Well, not all countries or not all cultures look at learning that same way. We look at, you know, how much of a functioning member of society are you? Is it because of your behavior? So these are just kind of some of the basics. All right, so here we go. For those of you who are in class, whether you're watching it the first day or the second day, either way, I don't want to give too much away, but I'm going to say Pavlov and like, I hope it works. Anyway, Pavlov. Okay, so I know I'm freaking out about this, but I just love talking about classical conditioning because Ivan Pavlov was a Russian physiologist. So he's a doctor studying like the physiology of the body. He's not a psychologist, but he's probably one of the more famous names that we associate, especially with behaviorism and learning. And he basically came up with the first understanding of classical conditioning. Like he is the premier classical conditioner. And so what he did is he had these dogs, and you can actually, that's Pavlov right there with the man with the beard. What Pavlov did was he trained his dogs to salivate, to drool. I mean, that's a natural reaction with a dog, right? If you have a dog, they drool. Well, what Pavlov was able to do was get the dogs to associate, remember that word associate? To associate one thing with another thing in order to get them to salivate, to drool. So eventually, Pavlov gets to the point where he has made such a strong association for his dogs. Like Pavlov's the one doing this. The dogs aren't doing it. It's like a natural reoccurrence. He's made such a strong connection and association that the dogs start like doing this all on their own. So here's what he would do. Pavlov would, he took his dogs and he would start like opening their food, right? Or pouring the food into their bowl. Well, now if you have a dog, you know like how excited your dog gets like when they're gonna get to eat, right? Well, what eventually he did is he would ring this bell and then he would give them the food. So he'd ring this bell and that sound they would associate with them getting food. So he'd ring the bell, give the food, ring the bell, give the food. Well, then the dogs would drool because they get food, right? When they had food in their mouths, they were like happy and they were drooling. Eventually, Pavlov got to the point where all he had to do was ring the bell. He didn't even have to give them the food. Sorry, bell. He didn't even have to give them the food, and they'd start drooling. They'd start salivating simply by the sound of the bell. Now, he did this in a couple of different ways. One time he did it with a cupboard door that he would open and close. He could get them to behave and respond based on however he wanted them to do. Like he manipulated the dogs into doing as he wished. That is classical conditioning. The dogs didn't train themselves. Pavlov trained them. Do you understand what I mean by classical conditioning there? So this is how it's going to happen. Now, that's Pavlov. He's like the OG. He's the original gangsta of classical conditioning. But there's another guy. Oh, I better go through this. I definitely need to go through this with you. I'm going to go through it in class. So when we talk about classical conditioning, we talk about this NS. The NS is the neutral stimulus. That means nothing. We start with what's called the unconditioned stimulus, or the UCS. If you see a US or UCS, it means the same thing. The unconditioned stimulus means nothing has been taught, nothing has been conditioned, nothing has been associated, right? So you have the unconditioned stimulus. The unconditioned stimulus elicits this natural response, right? You like a dog can't help but drool. Like you can't help but like dilate your pupils when like the sun is blaring in your eyes or something like that. So it's this unconditioned stimulus, or pardon me, unconditioned response. Well, what Pavlov is doing is he's taking this unconditioned stimulus and he's pairing it with this neutral stimulus, something that means absolutely nothing, in this case to the dogs. It was the bell. So he would take the unconditioned stimulus, which is the food for the dog, and he'd pair it with this bell. So the food means a lot to the dog, right? Because it gets them to salivate. But the bell means nothing to the dog. So he'd continue to pair them over and over and over. So the neutral stimulus, the bell, the unconditioned stimulus, the food, over and over and over again. You see those two lines there, right? And eventually we're going to get to the conditioned stimulus. And the conditioned stimulus, with these repeated pairings over and over, the association is made. So now we have the bell without the food. So pretty soon he can remove the food and just like ring the bell and they'll still salivate. And so then we get the salivation even without the food. That is the conditioned response. All right, so if you don't understand this too much, I would look at the figure on page 174, figure 6.2. That'll help explain it a little bit more. For those of you who are in class, I think you're gonna naturally get it. Again, if you need help with this and you're learning from home, please get in touch with me. I think I can maybe work it out and talk it out with you. When we talk about acquisition, now acquisition is this link between the neutral stimulus, in the case of Pavlov, the thing that means absolutely nothing, it's neutral, it doesn't have any effect, the bell, and the unconditioned stimulus. So the unconditioned stimulus is the food in Pavlov's case, right? Well, the acquisition is the point where time after time after time after time, you link these two, you associate this two, and now you acquire it. Now you have acquisition. Now you've gotten to the point where you can have a conditioned stimulus. Extinction is, well, think about what the word extinction means, right? It's going away. That's the diminishing of the conditioned response. So remember, the conditioned response is when they start salivating when they don't even have the food, right? They don't even have to have the food in order to start drooling. Extinction is when eventually that's going to go away. Like, it's eventually going to die out if they keep hearing this bell but never keep getting the food. Like, for a while it's going to work. Over time, that's going to kind of die out and it's going to go extinct. Spontaneous recovery is if he's done a good job at conditioning them, and actually I might just kind of bring it up again, and if I see a kid in the hallway right now, I might say Pavlov to them and see what happens. Did I train them well enough? It's all about a lab that we're going to do in class. If it happens again and they become conditioned again, that's called spontaneous recovery, where the conditioned response just comes back. Like, it was gone for a long time, but then it just kind of comes back on its own. And then we get to something called generalization. Now, you just heard the bell. This is a really good example. Generalization is, let's say Pavlov had this, like, one of those little ringing type bells, but let's say Pavlov switched out one of those ringing type bells with the bell we just heard, the ding, ding. If that worked and it got the dogs to start drooling, to start salivating again, then that would be a generalization. But if it didn't, then it's not a generalization. Then they didn't make that same connection. They didn't associate the one bell with the other bell to mean food is coming. All right, so a similar stimuli elicits a similar response after the conditioning. There's a good clip, if you know what I'm talking about, the Office clip. It has all things, I just love it. It's the one with Dwight and, oh, come on, Chris, I can't think of his name. Anyway, you know, if you're an Office fan, we'll watch it in class. He's like giving him these Tic Tacs, and eventually it's hilarious. You just look up conditioning in the Office, and you'll probably find the example. Okay, so I think this is the last slide. Okay, discrimination is the opposite of generalization. If you ring that bell, and then you put in a different type of bell, like the ding, ding, and the dogs would still do it, they would be generalized. It didn't matter what kind of neutral stimulus it was, right? Well, if it was a different type of stimulus and they did not respond, then they would be discriminating. Then they would be able to tell the difference between the ding, 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 ding and the ding, ding. If they had a difference and there was no conditioned response, then they have discriminated against those two stimuli, and it doesn't do anything for them. There's no association there. They haven't learned anything. They have very discriminating tastes, you might say. And then finally, aversive conditioning. Now, aversive conditioning is the response to a conditioned stimulus. An aversive response. Aversive means you don't like it. It's like bad, like you have an adverse condition, like it ain't good, okay? So you kind of see that picture. She's like, oh, that's terrible. You've probably, I bet you can give me an example. We'll hear probably 100 examples in class. The Garcia effect. It's named after this guy, Garcia, who basically said that we associate certain tastes or food with sickness. So perfect example, I can never eat, it's a brand of pizza called Freschetta pizza. In 1999, on Super Bowl Sunday, I ate Freschetta pizza and I was sick as a dog, like sicker than sick. I don't actually think it was from the Freschetta pizza. I don't think it was, but I got sick. Therefore, I have now associated that feeling of ugh with Freschetta pizza, and I ain't never eaten it again. Maybe it was that it was bad pizza. or probably because I just had like the flu bug or something happened. But that is the Garcia effect. So I hope you have some examples. Is there something that you associate, a taste that you associate with sickness, and therefore just you can't eat it anymore? And it maybe wasn't even because, actually, there's another example. Somebody said they ate way too many ears of corn when it was like sweet corn, like in September and August. And they ate so many ears of corn that they got sick. And so that was from the corn. But it was probably because they ate too much, not because the corn was bad. But they can't eat corn on the cob anymore. Like, they just can't eat it anymore because the thought of it makes them kind of sick. All right, so that's really going to be all that we do for today. For those of you who are at school, you're going to understand, I think, all of these concepts really well. For those of you who are at home and taking notes, please do your reading. Please make sure that you're reaching out to me if you have any questions on what all is going on. We will talk about little Albert, and you remember him, when we meet again. All right, till then, goodbye.